She was just a maid, or so everyone thought. When Cora Selwyn walked into Everard House for the first time, she was supposed to be invisible, but the Duke of Ashmore had never learned how to look away from things that refused to disappear, and she was about to become the most inconvenient woman he had ever encountered in his very long, very controlled, very meticulously ordered life. Subscribe for more stories like this. The thing about Agnes Selwyn was that she had, over the course of 30 years in domestic service, perfected the art of being exactly where she was needed, precisely when she was needed, and never, not once, at any other time. She was punctual, competent, and utterly unremarkable in the way that only the truly excellent ever managed to be. She had served 3 households in London, outlasted 2 lords and 1 very dramatic countess, and had risen to the position of senior lady's maid at the residence of Lady Fentworth on Grosvenor Square, a position she held with quiet dignity and no small measure of pride, which was why, on the morning of the 14th of April, when Agnes Selwyn twisted her ankle on the 2nd step of the servants' staircase at 5:30 in the morning, the entire carefully ordered machinery of Everard House very nearly came apart at the seams. Everard House was not, technically, Agnes's place of employment. She worked for Lady Fentworth, but Lady Fentworth had been invited, along with a considerable portion of London's titled population, to spend a fortnight at the country house of the Marchioness of Belmore. And in her absence, she had very generously lent Agnes's services to the Duke of Ashmore, who required a competent lady's maid to attend to his house guests during the first grand dinner party of the season. The Duke of Ashmore, Julian Everard, to those few people who dared use his Christian name, which was approximately 4 people in all of England, was not a man who tolerated disruption. He was 34 years old, possessed of a jaw that sculptors would have wept over, and a temperament that would have given them nightmares, and he had been managing his household, his estates, his finances, and the collective expectations of London society with the same precise, unnerving efficiency since he had inherited the dukedom at the age of 22. He did not like surprises. He had made this clear on multiple occasions, in multiple languages, to multiple members of his staff. And yet, at 5:30 on the morning of the 14th of April, Agnes Selwyn's ankle gave way, and the entire plan, the menu, the floral arrangements, the seating chart, the careful choreography of 12 courses and 40 guests, suddenly required a replacement. Agnes, lying on the kitchen floor with her ankle wrapped in a dish towel and her dignity in considerable disarray, looked up at the circle of concerned faces surrounding her and said, with remarkable composure, that there was only one solution. Her daughter, Cora, the housekeeper, Mrs. Pringle, a woman of stout build and stouter opinions, immediately had reservations. "Your daughter," she repeated, in the tone of a woman who had spent 40 years anticipating problems and was currently watching one materialize in real time. "The one who works at the lending library." "She is perfectly capable," Agnes said firmly, from the floor. "She knows everything I know. I taught her myself. She has excellent manners, quick hands, and she has attended to guests before." "At a lending library," Mrs. Pringle said again, as though the repetition would somehow improve the situation. "Mrs. Pringle," Agnes said, in the voice she reserved for moments of absolute non-negotiation, "it is 5:30 in the morning. The Duke's dinner is in 14 hours, and I cannot walk. Fetch my daughter." Mrs. Pringle fetched her daughter. Cora Selwyn arrived at Everard House at 7 o'clock in the morning, carrying a canvas bag, wearing her second-best dress, and looking, as Mrs. Pringle would later report to the under-butler, who would report it to the footman, who would whisper it to the kitchen maid, entirely too composed for a girl in her situation. She was 23 years old, tall for a woman of her era, with her mother's dark hair pinned neatly beneath a cap, her mother's economical movements, and, this was the part Mrs. Pringle found most unsettling, none of her mother's careful deference. Not that Cora was rude. She was not rude at all. She listened attentively, asked 2 precise and intelligent questions about the evening's schedule, requested a tour of the guest quarters, and then proceeded to organize the linen closet with a methodical efficiency that left Mrs. Pringle with the uncomfortable feeling that she was the one being managed. "You are very calm," Mrs. Pringle observed, as she showed Cora the arrangement of Lady Castleton's room, where the Duke's most formidable guest would be staying for the fortnight. "Panicking takes time," Cora said pleasantly, examining the layout of the dressing table. "And time, as I understand it, is rather short." Mrs. Pringle could not find an objection to this. She moved on. The morning passed in a blur of preparation. Cora attended to Lady Castleton's arrival with quiet competence, managing the elderly Countess's considerable luggage, her even more considerable opinions about the arrangement of her room, and a small and temperamental lapdog named Biscuit, all with the same pleasant, unhurried manner that Mrs. Pringle was finding increasingly difficult to categorize. Cora was not servile. That was the word for it. She was helpful. She was professional. She was everything a lady's maid ought to be. But there was something in the way she held herself, a certain straightness of spine, a certain steadiness of gaze, that was distinctly at odds with the careful self-effacement that domestic service typically required. She did not look down when she ought. She did not lower her eyes at the appropriate moments. She simply looked at people, clearly and directly, as though she found them genuinely interesting and saw absolutely no reason to pretend otherwise. It was, Mrs. Pringle felt, going to cause problems. She was right. The Duke of Ashmore did not, as a general rule, involve himself in the preparations for his own dinner parties. That was what he employed a housekeeper, a butler, a cook, 2 footmen, and a considerable annual household budget for. He appeared at the appointed hour, immaculately dressed, entirely prepared to be charming to exactly the degree that social obligation required, and not 1 degree more. On the evening of the 14th of April, however, a small crisis involving a broken decanter and a consequent rearrangement of the drawing room required his brief attention at approximately 6:30, 30 minutes before the guests were due to arrive, and it was in the course of attending to this crisis that he walked through the door of the upper hallway and came face to face with Cora Selwyn. She was carrying an armful of Lady Castleton's evening shawls, 3 of them, each one more elaborately fringed than the last, and she was moving with that particular focused speed that the pre-dinner hour demanded. She did not see him until they were nearly upon each other, and when she did, she stopped and looked at him. This was, in itself, not unusual. People frequently looked at the Duke of Ashmore. He was, by all objective measures, a striking figure, tall, dark-haired, with the kind of angular features that society painters spent years trying to capture and generally failed. Women looked at him with hope or calculation, or both. Men looked at him with the careful assessment that social hierarchy required. Servants, as a rule, looked somewhere around his left shoulder and pretended to be portraits. Cora Selwyn looked at him the way one looked at a person, not with awe, not with calculation, not with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned to make themselves small. She simply looked at him, clear-eyed and entirely unbothered, for exactly the span of time that it took her to register who he was. And then she said, calmly, "Your Grace," gave a brief, correct nod of acknowledgement, and stepped neatly around him to continue down the hallway. Julian Everard, the Duke of Ashmore, stood in his own corridor and watched her go. He could not have said afterward precisely what had happened. Nothing had happened. Technically, a maid had passed him in a hallway. This occurred, in a house of this size, several times a day. It was entirely unremarkable, and yet he stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, with the peculiar sensation of a man who has walked into a room and forgotten why he came, except that in this case he had not forgotten at all. He remembered perfectly. He simply found, unaccountably, that the room had become more interesting than his original purpose. He went downstairs. He told himself to stop thinking about it. He was, as he would learn over the next several weeks, not very good at that. The dinner party was, by the standards of the London season, a considerable success. The food was excellent, the wine was better, the conversation was the particular kind of sparkling that 40 people of various intelligence and unlimited ambition could produce when properly assembled. The Duke was charming and remote in equal measure, which was precisely what was expected of him. He was also, in a way he found deeply inconvenient, aware of every moment that the door opened to admit a member of the serving staff. Cora appeared twice, once to attend to Lady Castleton's shawl, which had slipped in a way that the elderly Countess found intolerable, and once in response to a summons from Mrs. Hargrove, a younger guest who had spilled something deeply red on something deeply white. Both times she was quick, competent, and utterly composed. Both times she moved through the room with that same unhurried efficiency, neither invisible nor intrusive, simply present in a way that somehow managed to be both professional and, he thought, with irritation, entirely too noticeable. Lady Castleton, who had been watching the Duke with the attentiveness of a woman who had spent 72 years observing people and missed very little of it, leaned toward her host during the third course and said, in a tone designed to carry precisely as far as his ear and no further, "Your new girl is remarkably capable." "She is Mrs. Selwyn's daughter," Julian said, without looking up from his soup. "A temporary arrangement." "Is she?" Lady Castleton said, in a tone that suggested she found this information interesting in a way that had nothing to do with domestic staffing. "How very convenient for us all." Julian let the remark pass. He was good at that. What he was less good at, he was discovering, was the particular quality of Cora Selwyn's gaze when it happened. Briefly, professionally, inevitably, to meet his as she moved through the room. It was not bold. It was not a challenge. It was simply, again, the gaze of a person who looked at other people as though they were genuinely worth looking at, and who had apparently not received the instruction that he was not. He found, by the end of the evening, that he was constructing reasons why the temporary arrangement might need to be extended. He did not examine this impulse too closely. The extension was, in the end, made necessary not by the Duke's entirely separate and unrelated preferences, but by Agnes Selwyn's ankle, which had turned out to be worse than initially assessed. The physician confirmed a sprain of some significance, and Agnes, who had, in 30 years of service, taken exactly 2 days off for illness and considered this an embarrassing excess, was confined to rest for a minimum of 2 weeks. Cora, therefore, stayed. The household settled into its routines around her with the pragmatic adaptability of well-run establishments. Mrs. Pringle, who had begun the arrangement with reservations, found those reservations dissolving in the face of Cora's consistent competence. The guests liked her. Lady Castleton, in particular, had taken to requesting her specifically, which was both a compliment and a considerable additional workload, as Lady Castleton's requests were extensive and frequently baroque. The Duke, for his part, managed 4 days before he engineered a second encounter. He was not proud of this. He was a man of considerable self-discipline, and he was aware that what he was doing was not, strictly speaking, the behaviour of a man who had no interest in a member of his domestic staff, but the library was, genuinely, a room he used every morning, and Cora did, genuinely, pass through it each morning on her way to attend to Lady Castleton. These were facts that he had, for the first time in recent memory, arranged to be in the library at the precise moment of her passing was a detail he preferred not to dwell on. The first morning, she passed through without incident. He said, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning, Your Grace." That was that. The second morning, she was carrying a book. He noticed it because it was not one of his. It was smaller than his library's volumes, older, worn at the spine in the way that books were worn by people who read them repeatedly and with genuine feeling rather than for display. He recognized the binding. It was a collection of essays, philosophical, not the sort of thing one generally expected. "Is that Wollstonecraft?" he said, before he had made any conscious decision to speak. She stopped, looked at the book in her hand. then at him, with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite its absence, something more like careful assessment. "It is," she said. "Which essay?" A pause. Then, "The vindication of the rights of woman." She said it evenly, without apology, without the self-consciousness he might have expected. Julian had read it himself, a fact that would have surprised most of his acquaintance. Mahal. "And what do you make of it?" Another pause. Longer this time. She was, he realized, deciding how to answer. Not because she did not know what she thought, but because she was trying to determine whether to tell him. "I find it correct," she said at last, "in its observations, though perhaps optimistic in its conclusions." He blinked. In the 12 years he had spent in London society, he had discussed Wollstonecraft precisely once with his university tutor, and the tutor had largely disagreed. Optimistic how? "She believes that if women were educated equally, they would be regarded equally," Cora said. "I think she overestimates the willingness of people to revise their opinions in light of evidence." There was a small, startled silence. Then, unexpectedly, the Duke of Ashmore laughed. It was a short, genuine sound, not the social laugh he deployed at dinner parties, but something considerably less practiced and considerably more real. "That," he said, "is possibly the most accurate observation I have heard in recent months." She looked at him for a moment, that clear, direct look, and then gave a small nod that might, very slightly, have contained the beginning of a smile. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said, and went upstairs. Julian stood in his library for some time after she left, looking at the space where she had been, with the feeling of a man who has, without entirely meaning to, opened a door that he is not certain he knows how to close. Her name was Victoire Lemaire, and she was, by general consensus of London society, almost certainly going to be the next Duchess of Ashmore. She was 25, French by ancestry and English by upbringing, possessed of considerable fortune, considerable beauty, and a social intelligence so refined that it operated like a well-maintained clock, visible in its results, invisible in its mechanisms. She had been introduced to the Duke the previous season through a chain of connections so elaborate that it would have required a diagram to explain, and what had begun as a mild social acquaintance had deepened over the course of several months into something that the gossip columns referred to as an understanding, and which the Duke's closest friend, Viscount Hartley, referred to as the most comfortable and least interesting attachment I have ever witnessed. The Viscount was not entirely wrong. Julian's understanding with Victoire Lemaire was comfortable. It was sensible. She was exactly the sort of woman a duke in his position ought to marry. Well-connected, well-mannered, entirely appropriate. And he had been moving toward a formal offer with the steady, unhurried progress of a man completing a task that he had identified as necessary and intended to discharge efficiently. The understanding was not, technically, an engagement. There had been no formal declaration, no announcement in the papers, but there had been conversations and expectations, and, most significantly, there had been Victoire's mother, the formidable Madame Lemaire, who had the manner of a woman who considered the matter settled and was simply waiting for the appropriate paperwork. Cora did not know about Victoire. This was not precisely a deception on Julian's part. Cora was a temporary member of his domestic staff. There was no reason she would be informed of his personal arrangements, and no occasion on which the subject would naturally arise. He was not conducting a courtship. He was having morning conversations about philosophy with a remarkably interesting woman, which was entirely, he told himself, appropriate. This was, as Viscount Hartley would have told him, a spectacular piece of self-deception. But Julian did not tell Hartley about the morning conversations. The thing about houses like Everard House, about any house in which a large number of people lived and worked in close quarters, was that nothing stayed secret for very long. Not really. The architecture of below-stairs life was built on observation. Who went where? Who spoke to whom? who lingered when they ought to have moved on. The footman, Thomas, had noticed, by the third day, that the Duke was spending considerably more time in the library between 7 and 8 in the morning than had previously been his habit. Thomas mentioned this to the kitchen maid, Eleanor, who had noticed that the new lady's maid passed through the library on her way upstairs and often did not emerge for 10 or 15 minutes. Eleanor mentioned this to the under-butler, Peters, who filed it away in the comprehensive mental catalogue he maintained of household dynamics and said nothing to anyone above stairs, which was precisely how these things were managed. Mrs. Pringle knew. Mrs. Pringle always knew. She observed it with the particular resignation of a woman who had seen this sort of thing before and understood that it generally ended in one of two ways, badly or very badly. She said nothing to Cora, because Cora had not asked, and because Mrs. Pringle had learned in 40 years of service that unsolicited advice was rarely taken and frequently resented. She did, however, take to leaving the library door slightly more open than strictly necessary, which she felt covered her obligations in the matter. Cora, for her own part, was not unaware that the morning conversations had taken on a quality that exceeded the strictly professional. She was, as she had demonstrated repeatedly, not a woman who benefited from self-deception. She knew perfectly well that the Duke of Ashmore was finding reasons to encounter her that were not derived from household necessity. She knew, equally, that she was finding the encounters considerably more interesting than was wise. She told herself, in the privacy of her own thoughts, that it was purely intellectual. He was an extraordinarily well-read man with a sharper mind than his social performance suggested, and the conversations were the most genuinely engaging she had experienced in years. The lending library offered many things, but conversations about philosophy with someone who had both read the books and understood them were not, generally, among them. She also told herself that the way he listened, with his full attention, without condescension, without the glazed politeness she was accustomed to receiving when she expressed an opinion in company, was simply refreshing, and nothing more. She was, as she would later reflect, not entirely honest with herself. On the 6th morning, he brought the chessboard. She had mentioned, in passing, that she had taught herself to play from a book, which he had found so characteristic of everything he had learned about her that he had not been able to let it pass without commentary. She had defended the method with considerable spirit, arguing that learning from a book was in many respects superior to learning from a person, as books did not sigh or adjust their expectations mid-game. He had argued, with equal spirit, that books did not correct specific errors in real time. She had said she had not made any. He had said that was the most overconfident thing he had ever heard, which was saying something, given that he had spent 12 years among London's aristocracy. The chessboard, therefore, was both a game and a point being made, and they both knew it. She was, it turned out, extremely good, not perfect. He identified 3 moments in the first game where a different choice would have served her better, but her strategy was sound, her patience exceptional, and her willingness to sacrifice pieces when necessary was the kind of ruthless pragmatism that less experienced players never managed. She played the way she moved through a room, efficiently, with an eye on the whole board, rather than the nearest piece. He won the first game. Barely. She noted his 2 remaining advantages with the precision of a woman taking inventory, reset the pieces, and said, again. He won the second game by a margin so thin that it required charitable interpretation. On the third game, she beat him. It was not a spectacular victory. It was incremental, methodical, almost gentle, in the way that a tide is gentle, while it is nonetheless inexorably relocating the shore. He saw it coming 2 moves before it arrived and could not, entirely, prevent it. When it was done, she sat back slightly in her chair and looked at the board with the expression of a woman confirming a theory she had held for some time. "You play correctly," she said, "but you are slightly unwilling to lose material in the early game. It makes your mid-game conservative." Julian looked at her. Then he looked at the board. Then he said, That is the most accurate assessment of my chess game that anyone has ever made. He paused. It is also possibly a fair description of other things. She looked up at that, and something passed between them, brief, unguarded, warm, before she dropped her gaze to the board and began resetting the pieces. "Shall we play again, Your Grace?" she said, in a tone that was carefully, precisely, entirely professional. "Yes," he said. "Ah, we shall." Neither of them was talking about chess, entirely. Neither of them said so. Victoire Lemaire arrived at Everard House on a Thursday. She had not been invited to the dinner party. She had been in the country for the early part of the season, but she called in the afternoon with her mother and her impeccable manners, and was received in the drawing room with the warmth that Julian's position required him to extend to a woman with whom he had an understanding. She was, as always, lovely, pale, and perfectly arranged, with a smile that was genuine without being excessive, and conversation that was intelligent without being challenging. She asked after the dinner party. She admired the arrangements in the drawing room. She was, in every respect, precisely what she always was. An excellent woman who would make an excellent duchess. Julian sat across from her and listened to himself respond to her questions and thought, with a clarity that he found somewhat alarming, that he could not remember the last morning conversation they had had that surprised him. He did not permit himself to think about why this thought was occurring to him now. He was a man of discipline. Cora encountered Victoire in the corridor outside the drawing room. It was a brief encounter. Victoire was on her way out. Cora was passing with a stack of linens. There was barely time for more than a glance. But Victoire Lemaire had the social awareness of a woman who noticed everything, and she paused. "You are the new girl," she said pleasantly. "Mrs. Selwyn's daughter." "Yes, ma'am," Cora said. Victoire looked at her for a moment, not unkindly, simply with the attentiveness of a woman assessing a situation. "The Duke speaks well of you," she said. "He mentioned your mother's arrangement. I am glad she is recovering." "Thank you, ma'am," Cora said, pleasantly, evenly, with absolutely nothing on her face that was not perfectly appropriate. "How much longer do you expect to stay?" Victoire asked, with the warmth of genuine inquiry rather than anything sharper. "Until my mother is well, ma'am," Cora said. "I couldn't say precisely." Victoire nodded and moved on, and Cora continued down the corridor with her linens. And that was that. Except it was not that, because Cora spent the rest of the afternoon in the methodical completion of her duties with the focused efficiency of someone who has decided that thinking about something is not useful and is therefore not going to do it. She was, she told herself, a maid who had borrowed her mother's position for a fortnight. She had always known this. Nothing had changed. She went to bed at 10 o'clock and read Wollstonecraft until she fell asleep. Viscount Hartley arrived the following afternoon, uninvited, which was his custom, and found Julian in the library in the middle of the morning, which was not interesting, said Hartley, leaning in the doorway with the easy elegance of a man who had spent 30 years making himself comfortable in other people's spaces. "You're in here before noon, on a Friday." "I live here," Julian said, without looking up from his book. "You live here," Hartley agreed, "but you generally do it in the study on Friday mornings. The library is a different room with a different atmosphere, which I suspect is not coincidental." He came in and sat down, uninvited, in the chair across from Julian's preferred reading position, which was, had he known it, the same chair Cora occupied during their chess games. "Who is she?" Julian turned a page. "I don't know what you're referring to. You are in the wrong room at the wrong time reading a book upside down," Hartley said pleasantly. "I have been your friend for 15 years. I know your rooms and your schedules and your tell, which is that when something is occupying your attention that you don't wish to discuss, you read. Who is she?" There was a pause. "She is Mrs. Selwyn's daughter," Julian said, in the tone of a man providing relevant facts. Hartley's eyebrows performed a movement of considerable expressiveness. "Brr, the temporary maid." "She is," Julian said evenly, an exceptionally intelligent woman who has read more widely than most of my acquaintance, plays chess at a level that is frankly embarrassing for me to admit, and holds opinions about political philosophy that she expresses with a directness I find—" He stopped. "Refreshing," Hartley offered. "Yes," Julian said, after a moment. With the precision of a man conceding a point, Hartley was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough to be notable. Then, "Julian, Victoire." "I am aware of Victoire." "Are you?" Hartley said, "because what I am observing does not especially resemble awareness of Victoire." Julian put down his book. He looked at Hartley, who was watching him with the particular expression of a man who has watched his friend make decisions for 15 years and has learned when to speak and when to let silence do the work. "Nothing has happened," Julian said. "I know nothing has happened," Hartley said. "That's not entirely the point, is it?" Julian said nothing, which was, Hartley felt, an answer. Agnes Selwyn wrote to her daughter every third day. The letters were practical, efficient, and full of the kind of specific household intelligence that only a woman who had spent 30 years in service could provide. Which guests preferred their tea week, which footman needed watching near the silver, how to manage Lady Castleton's opinions on window dressings. The letter that arrived on Tuesday morning was different. It began, as always, with practicalities. Agnes's ankle was improving. The physician had revised his estimate. With rest and attention, she might be on her feet within the week. Then, in Agnes's precise and upright hand, "I hear from Peters that you are managing admirably, which does not surprise me. I also hear, from a source I will not name but whose reliability I would stake my reputation on, that the morning library visits have become a habit of some regularity. Cora, I need you to be sensible. You are a clever girl, and I have always been proud of that. Be clever now. The Duke is a good man, or so I believe him to be. But he is still a Duke, and you are still my daughter, and whatever happens in that library, it will end when I come back. It must. I am not saying this to be unkind. I am saying it because I love you, and because the world is what it is, and not what either of us might prefer." Cora read the letter twice. Then she folded it neatly and put it in her apron pocket and went about her day. She was, that morning, 15 minutes later than usual passing through the library. Julian noticed. He did not mention it. He set up the chessboard, and she sat down, and they played. She won in 43 moves. He analysed the game afterward with more attention than was strictly necessary. She watched him do it with an expression that she could not quite keep entirely neutral. "Your Grace," she said, when they had packed up the pieces. "Miss Selwyn," he said. She opened her mouth, closed it. Then, "Nothing. Good morning." He let her go. He told himself it was the right decision. The library felt very quiet afterward. The dinner party had been the beginning. And as April deepened into May, the London season bloomed around Everard House with all its traditional extravagance. There were balls and musicales and afternoon calls, carriages clattering over cobblestones at all hours, the relentless social machinery of a society that considered the business of marrying off its young people to be of approximately equivalent importance to affairs of state. Victoire attended several of these events on Julian's arm, and London society, which had elevated speculation to an art form, observed them with satisfaction and drew the expected conclusions. The gossip columns, those tireless chroniclers of aristocratic life, noted the Duke's attendance at the Pemberton ball and his subsequent supper with Miss Lemaire's family with the quiet approval of people who felt that things were proceeding in an orderly fashion. Below stairs, the atmosphere was somewhat less orderly. Thomas the footman had graduated from observation to active investment in the situation, which he discussed with Eleanor the kitchen maid with a depth of analysis that would have served him well in a career of political journalism. Peters the under-butler maintained his policy of dignified silence while clearly knowing everything. Mrs. Pringle had stopped adjusting the library door and had started, for reasons she declined to explain, keeping a particularly fine china tea service available between 7 and 8 each morning. Lady Castleton, who had by now been in the house long enough to have formed strong views about everyone in it, said nothing, but she watched, with the bright and patient attention of a woman who had seen enough of life to know that the most interesting chapters rarely announce themselves. Cora said nothing either. She was sensible, as her mother had asked her to be. She attended to her duties, she managed Lady Castleton's increasingly complex schedule, and she limited the library conversations to topics she could be certain would not lead anywhere she could not afford to go. This worked for approximately 11 days. It rained on a Thursday in May, the kind of determined English rain that arrived without apology and settled in as though it intended to become a permanent resident. The afternoon calls were cancelled. The planned carriage ride was abandoned. Everard House settled into the particular hushed quality of a large building full of people, all trapped indoors with their own thoughts. Cora had brought a tray to Lady Castleton and was returning when she heard it. The piano. Someone was playing in the music room, which was not, at this hour, usual. She would have continued past, but the music stopped abruptly in the middle of a phrase, as though the player had lost the thread, and was followed by a silence that had a quality to it. She recognized as frustration. She should have continued past. She knew this. She opened the door. Julian was at the piano, jacket off, which was by itself unusual, sleeves rolled to the elbow, which was considerably more so. He was looking at the keys with the expression of a man engaged in a personal conflict with an inanimate object. He looked up when she came in, and she saw, for the first time, something unguarded in his face. Not distress, exactly, but the absence of the careful composure he generally maintained. "I apologize," she said immediately. "I heard the music stop. I thought perhaps—" She stopped. What had she thought, precisely? That was the question. "Come in," he said, simply, without hesitation, in a tone that was not the Duke speaking to a maid but something less categorized and more honest. She came in. She stood by the piano and looked at the sheet music on the stand, a Beethoven sonata, technically demanding. The passage he had broken off at marked with a pencil annotation. "Why the transition?" she said, before she could stop herself. Between the second and third movement, he looked at her. "You play." "My mother's employer before Lady Fentworth had a daughter who played," she said. "I turned pages for 8 years. You begin to learn things." Something softened in his expression. "Show me," he said, and moved along the bench. She should not have sat down. She was aware of this with perfect clarity. She sat down anyway. The music room was quiet except for the rain against the windows. She played the transition, slowly, imperfectly, the technique of someone who had learned by listening rather than by instruction. But the phrasing was right. The understanding of the music was right. And when she finished, she could feel his attention like a physical thing. "Yes," he said quietly. "Like that." They were sitting very close on the piano bench, closer than was appropriate by any standard she cared to name. Outside, the rain was steady and grey. Inside, the room was warm. She became aware, in the way that one becomes aware of things one has been deliberately not noticing, that she was looking at him, and he was looking at her, and neither of them was looking at the piano. She stood up. "I should go," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady, which she felt was a considerable personal achievement. "Miss Selwyn." He stood too. "Your Grace." She met his eyes for one moment, direct and clear and entirely honest, and what she put in that look was everything she could not say. Then she went to the door, and she opened it, and she walked out, and she did not look back. Julian stood at the piano in the quiet music room and listened to the rain and tried, with limited success, to think clearly about anything at all. Mrs. Pringle, who had been running the domestic affairs of Everard House for 14 years, was not a woman who interfered in matters above her station. She was, however, a woman who had obligations, and one of those obligations was, she felt, to Cora Selwyn, who had come to her house on a Tuesday morning with a canvas bag and no complaint, and had done everything asked of her, and then considerably more, and who was. This was Mrs. Pringle's private assessment, offered to no one, the finest temporary arrangement she had ever had the good fortune to stumble into. She found Cora in the linen room that evening, reorganizing what was already perfectly organized, which was, Mrs. Pringle recognized, what this particular young woman did when she was thinking hard about something she could not say aloud. Mrs. Pringle sat down, which she rarely did in the course of a working day, and said, "Sit." Cora sat. "There is," Mrs. Pringle said, "a woman named Victoire Lemaire." The slight pause before Cora's expression settled told Mrs. Pringle everything she needed to know about the state of Cora's existing knowledge. "I have met her," Cora said, evenly. "Did you know," Mrs. Pringle said, "that there is an understanding?" A longer pause. "I suspected," Cora said, "from the manner of her visit." Mrs. Pringle looked at her for a moment. Cora's face was composed, genuinely composed, the composure of a woman who was feeling things and had made a decision about what to do with them, not the blankness of someone who was simply numb. "Your mother comes back next week," Mrs. Pringle said. "I know," Cora said, "and that is that." "And that is that," Cora agreed, with a quietness that Mrs. Pringle found considerably more affecting than distress would have been. Mrs. Pringle stood up. She was not, as previously established, a woman who interfered. "You are," she said, at the door, "the best temporary arrangement I have ever had, and I have had 37 of them." Cora looked up. "I thought you should know," Mrs. Pringle said, and went back to her duties. Lady Castleton had been quiet for long enough. She was, by her own estimate, and the reluctant consensus of everyone who knew her, a woman of considerable perception and even more considerable opinion, and she had spent 3 weeks in Everard House observing a situation that she found both obvious and, in its current trajectory, deeply unsatisfying. She had watched the Duke of Ashmore conduct his orderly, sensible, entirely correct understanding with Victoire Lemaire. She had watched Cora Selwyn move through the house with her particular quality of careful composure. She had watched, with 72 years of experience behind her, the particular way that two people who are in the presence of someone genuinely interesting to them fail to be entirely natural. She had also had 14 years of Everard House dinner parties. And she knew, because she had known his mother, that Julian Everard's habitual reserve was not indifference, but armour, and that the last time she had seen it genuinely pierced had been when he was 19 years old, and his mother was still alive. Lady Castleton was not a romantic. She was something considerably more useful. A realist who understood that certain situations required intervention because the people in them were too principled to intervene themselves. She summoned Cora on a Friday morning. "Sit down, child," she said, from her chair by the window. Cora sat. "But I am going to say something to you that is not, technically, my business, and I should like you to hear it without arguing until I am finished." Cora said nothing, which Lady Castleton took as assent. "You are intelligent enough to know what is happening in this house," Lady Castleton said. "You are principled enough to be doing nothing about it. I am not here to encourage you to do anything foolish. I am here to tell you that the understanding between the Duke and Miss Lemaire is precisely that. An understanding, not a betrothal. There has been no formal declaration. There has been no announcement. There has been, as far as anyone outside this house knows, a polite social acquaintance that may or may not proceed to a formal offer." Cora was very still. "I am also going to tell you," Lady Castleton continued, "that I have known Julian Everard since he was 14 years old, and I have never, in 20 years, seen him read Wollstonecraft." She paused. "He told me you recommended it." Something moved across Cora's face, involuntary, warm, quickly controlled. "Lady Castleton," she said, carefully, "I am a maid." "You are Mrs. Selwyn's daughter," Lady Castleton said, with some precision. who is a woman of entirely respectable birth and considerable education, employed in domestic service by economic necessity, which is a circumstance and not a condition. The season, she added, has produced stranger recalibrations than this. I have seen 3. Cora looked at her for a long moment. What would you have me do? She said. Absolutely nothing, Lady Castleton said crisply. I am simply making sure you are in possession of accurate information. What you do with it is entirely your own affair. She reached for her teacup. You may go. Cora went. Lady Castleton looked out the window at the London street below and drank her tea and felt, if not satisfied exactly, then at least as though she had discharged her obligations in the matter. Agnes Selwyn returned to Everard House on a Monday, walking with a cane, but walking, which she announced as though it were a personal victory over the forces of disorder, which in a sense it was. Cora had known she was coming. She had prepared for it with the same methodical efficiency she applied to everything, packing her canvas bag, organising her mother's notes back into their proper order, ensuring that the transition would be seamless. What she had not prepared for, precisely, was the morning. She had told herself she would not go to the library. Her mother was back. It was over. It had always been going to be over. And she had always known that. And the sensible thing, the Selwyn thing, the thing her mother's letter had asked of her, was to complete her last day with grace and go home. She went to the library. She was not entirely sure why. Some things, she thought, deserved a proper ending rather than simply stopping. He was there. Of course he was there. He was standing at the window rather than reading, which meant he had known she would come, and the fact that he had been waiting, that he had not pretended to coincidence or engineering, meant something she did not entirely let herself examine. My mother is back, she said. I know, he said. Peters told me this morning. She stood just inside the door, canvas bag in hand, in her second-best dress, which was the same dress she had been wearing on the first morning, because she had come with what she'd had, and that was what she had. She had always known exactly what she was. That had never been unclear. Then this is the last morning, she said. He said nothing for a moment. Then, it doesn't have to be. She looked at him steadily. Your Grace. Julian, he said, which was, she counted, possibly the 5th time anyone had used his Christian name in her presence. And the first time he had offered it, something tightened in her chest. She did not let it show. Julian, she said, carefully, testing the shape of it. There is a Miss Lemaire. He was quiet for a moment. Then, there is an understanding, he said. It is not a betrothal. It amounts to the same thing. It does not, he said, with a quiet certainty that she recognized, because it was the same quality she heard in her own voice when she was sure of something. Cora, I am aware of what is appropriate and what is not. I am also aware that I have spent 3 weeks having the most interesting conversations of my adult life with a woman who beats me at chess and reads Wollstonecraft and plays Beethoven by ear and has an opinion about everything that is worth hearing. He paused. I would prefer not to simply let that end because the calendar requires it. She looked at him for a long time. Then she set down her canvas bag. You have obligations, she said. I do, he agreed, and I am going back to the lending library. Yes, he said, unless, she said quietly. They looked at each other across the library. I would call, he said, properly, with intention. That, she said, would cause rather a lot of talk. Yes, he said, and smiled, briefly, genuinely. It would. She looked at him for another moment. Then she picked up her bag. You have a great deal to sort out first, she said. I do, he agreed. Then you should do that. She moved toward the door. At the threshold, she paused and looked back and met his eyes with the same direct, uncomplicated gaze she had given him from the first morning. Good morning, Your Grace. Good morning, Miss Selwyn, he said. She went, and this time she was smiling. What happened next became, in the weeks and months that followed, the subject of considerable retelling in London drawing rooms, each version slightly more dramatic than the last, until the whole affair had acquired the burnished quality of legend that certain stories earn by being, at their core, entirely true. The facts, as they actually occurred, were these. Julian Everard, the Duke of Ashmore, called on Victoire Le Maire that same Monday afternoon. He was correct and kind and entirely honest, which was both less comfortable and more respectful than any number of alternatives would have been. He told her that his feelings had clarified in a direction that he did not believe was fair to her, and that a woman of her quality deserved an attachment from a man whose feelings were unambiguous, which his were not, in the direction of her. He said this without blaming anyone, without the social evasions that such conversations typically employed. And Victoire, who was, as previously noted, an intelligent woman, understood him with a clarity that was painful and accurate in equal measure. She did not weep. She was Victoire Le Maire, and she had too much sense and too much dignity for that, at least in company. She thanked him for his honesty, which she said she preferred to the alternative. And when he had gone, she sat for a long time in her drawing room with her mother, who said absolutely nothing, which was, for Madame Le Maire, an extraordinary exercise of restraint. London society learned of it within 48 hours, because London society always did. The gossip columns, which had been congratulating themselves on their predictive accuracy, were required to issue a revision, which they did with the enthusiasm of people who found the unexpected considerably more interesting than the expected. Lady Castleton, when she heard, said only, "Well," in a tone of considerable satisfaction, and went back to her needlework. Mrs. Pringle said nothing, but was observed by Thomas to be humming in the kitchen, which she had not done since Christmas. Viscount Hartley, when Julian told him the whole story, the library, the chess, the piano, the rain, all of it, listened with the attention of a man receiving information he had been awaiting for some time, and then said, "The maid who reads Wollstonecraft." "She works in a lending library," Julian said. "Of course she does," Hartley said. "Oh, of course she does. Julian, when are you calling?" "Thursday," Julian said. Hartley nodded. "I will want a full account on Friday," he said. He came on Thursday, as he had said he would. He came not to Everard House, which was his, but to the rooms above the bookshop on Marlborough Street, where Agnes Selwyn had lived for the past 11 years, where the landing smelled of paper and beeswax and something Agnes had been cooking that morning, and where Cora opened the door in a plain blue dress with no cap, and her hair pinned in the practical way she wore it when she was not working, and looked at him for a moment with an expression that was several things at once. He had brought nothing. He had debated this, flowers, books, something, and had decided that arriving without props was more honest, that this was not a performance and ought not to look like one. "I said I would call," he said. "You did," she agreed, and stepped back from the door. Agnes Selwyn, seated in the front room with her ankle on a footstool and a piece of mending in her lap that she was not currently mending, looked up at the Duke of Ashmore, who was standing in her sitting room in a coat that cost more than her quarterly salary, and holding his hat in both hands in a way that suggested he was not, in this particular moment, thinking about coats or quarterly salaries. "Or, Your Grace," she said, with the composure of a woman who had prepared herself for this possibility and still found it somewhat extraordinary. "Mrs. Selwyn," he said, "I am sorry about your ankle." "It is improving," Agnes said. "Please sit down." He sat. Cora sat across from him. Agnes looked between them with the expression of a woman who had given sensible advice and was observing, with a complicated mixture of feelings, the consequences of its not being taken, and who was not, if she was honest, entirely sorry. The conversation that followed was not, precisely, the conversation that any of them might have scripted. Julian was direct. in the way that he was direct when he had decided to be. He said that he had an interest in Cora's acquaintance, that he intended to pursue properly. If Agnes had no objection, and if Cora was willing, which he understood were two separate questions requiring two separate answers. He said that he was aware of the various ways in which this was unconventional, and that he was not, in this particular instance, interested in convention. Agnes looked at him for a long moment. "My daughter," she said, "is not a project or an experiment." "I know," he said. "She is also," Agnes continued, with a slight emphasis that her daughter would have recognized as the voice she reserved for non-negotiation, "not a woman who will be managed or arranged." "I am aware of that," he said. "I find it—" He paused, and a very slight smile moved across his face, one of the more appealing things about her. Agnes looked at Cora. Cora was looking at Julian with an expression that Agnes had not, in 23 years of her daughter's life, seen before, and which she recognized, from a long time ago, from a face she had loved very much, as the expression of a person who has found something they did not know they were looking for. "To tea," Agnes said, and stood up, which she did not do without effort, and went to the kitchen, which she did not have to do, because the kettle was already on the hob and the cups were already out. She was, she reflected, being extremely sensible about this. She put 3 teaspoons of tea in the pot, instead of 2, and considered herself well managed. London society, as previously noted, found the unexpected considerably more interesting than the expected. The Duke of Ashmore and Miss Cora Selwyn, daughter of Agnes Selwyn, late of Lady Fentworth's household, currently of the Marlborough Street Lending Library, became, over the course of the following weeks, the subject of the kind of fascinated, slightly scandalized, ultimately rather delighted social commentary that the season occasionally produced when it was not too busy producing the predictable. There were, of course, opinions. There were always opinions. There were matrons who disapproved, and young women who were privately envious, and older gentlemen who found the whole business irregular, and younger gentlemen who found it, on reflection, rather admirable. There were gossip columns, and there were drawing-room discussions, and there was the Marchioness of Belmore, who declared at a Tuesday morning call that she had always suspected the Duke was more interesting than he appeared, and that this proved it. Victoire Le Maire departed for a long visit to her relations in Normandy, which everyone agreed was the dignified choice, and which Victoire executed with the precision that characterized everything she did. She would, in time, make an excellent match with a man who was uncomplicated in his feelings toward her, and she would be content, and it would be, in the way that sensible arrangements often are, very nearly enough. Lady Castleton attended 3 events where Julian and Cora were both present, and was observed on each occasion to be in a state of somewhat uncharacteristic benevolence. At the 3rd of these events, an afternoon tea at the home of a mutual acquaintance, where Cora appeared not as a maid, but as a guest, which caused its own quantity of whispered commentary. Lady Castleton sat beside her for 20 minutes and spoke to her about books, and Cora spoke back, and it was noted by several observers that Lady Castleton laughed twice, which was felt by those who knew her to be significant. Agnes Selwyn returned to Lady Fentworth's service with her ankle healed and her opinions complicated. She had raised a daughter to be sensible, and sensible Cora was, in most respects. She had also raised a daughter to be honest, and honest she was, about what she felt and what she wanted and what she was willing to accept. Agnes had found, in the 2 weeks since the Thursday call, that it was difficult to argue with a happiness as clear and unperformative as her daughter's, even when one had reservations that were entirely reasonable and grounded in 30 years of seeing how the world arranged itself. She mentioned this to Mrs. Pringle the next time their paths crossed. Mrs. Pringle said, "She is the finest temporary arrangement I have ever had." She was not, Agnes said, with dignity, "a temporary arrangement." "No," Mrs. Pringle agreed. "I don't suppose she was." It was June when he asked her. They were in the library, his library, Everard House, though she came now as a guest, which was a difference she was still, occasionally, startled by. The chessboard was between them. She was winning. This was no longer, by any reasonable measure, surprising. He had been, she had noticed, slightly more than usually quiet for the past quarter of an hour, which was the particular quality of quiet that meant he was building towards something, rather than simply thinking. She captured his knight. He looked at the board and then, with the decision of a man who has concluded that the moment has arrived and that further preparation will not improve it, he said, "I should like to marry you." She looked up from the board. "I know," he said, before she could speak, "that it is irregular. I know that London will talk, and that there will be those who find it objectionable, and that your situation—" "Julian," she said. He stopped. You are doing the thing," she said, "where you explain a situation rather than occupy it." He looked at her. Then, quietly, "Yes, I suppose I am." "You should like to marry me," she said, not a question. Confirming. "Very much," he said, simply, without preamble, without the architectural supports of explanation and context. Simply, "Very much." Cora Selwyn looked at the man across the chessboard, at the careful, controlled, remarkably interesting man who had laughed in a library at 7:30 in the morning about Wollstonecraft and lost at chess without embarrassment and made room on a piano bench in the rain without asking permission, and felt the particular clarity of a woman who has always known her own mind and has arrived, at last, at a conclusion she had been approaching for some time. "Ça. You will find," she said, "that I have a great many opinions. I am counting on it," he said, "and I will not learn to be decorative." "God forbid," he said, with feeling, "and your household staff will require managing, which I am prepared to do, but I will do it my way." "Mrs. Pringle," he said, "will be delighted." Cora looked at him for one long, steady moment. Then she looked at the chessboard. Then she moved her queen. "Checkmate," she said. He looked at the board. "Yes, I see that. I will marry you," she said, "on the condition that you accept this outcome as representative." "Of chess. Of everything," she said serenely. Julian Everard, the Duke of Ashmore, looked at the woman across the board, at the clear, direct, entirely unbiddable woman who had walked into his house with a canvas bag and had not, for a single moment since, behaved as anything other than exactly herself, and felt the specific, unmistakable warmth of a man who has, without quite intending to, arrived somewhere he intends to stay. "Agreed," he said. "Good," she said, and then, because neither of them was very good at leaving things unoccupied, she reset the chess pieces, and he poured the tea, and they played another game, in the library, in the June afternoon light, with the whole of London going about its business outside, and absolutely no awareness of or interest in any of it. If you made it this far, you are one of us. Subscribe for part 2 and more Bridgerton-style stories. Drop it in the comments. Which scene was your favourite?